we'll do the live thing first. Like. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome to the show. If you ever want to support the podcast, go check us out at our Patreon, patreon.com/the-Bigmark-podcast. You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at the Bigmark Pod. Give us any messages there. Hit us up in the DMs if you want to hear any special topics. If you got anything to say, we'd love to hear from you. Rate and share the podcast if you can. If you tell one friend, like I always say, we can double the podcast overnight. And, you know, hit the bell if you're watching on YouTube. Hit the notifications and subscribe and make sure you see when any new videos drop. We're back again with some more action. You know, I was kind of getting ready for today's podcast and I was thinking, oh man, you know, I kind of talked about Joey Diaz last episode, but I was also talking to some of my friends, and not everyone necessarily listens to these in sequence, but everyone who's listening along, I love you. And we're going to go into another stand-up comedian today. I mean, gotta love Uncle Joey, and if you guys haven't heard that episode, go back to our last episode, the 50th episode. Oh my God, 50 episodes. He's on Joey Diaz, tremendous actor, stand-up comedian, overall comedian, but today I'm going to kind of go a little bit deeper. I just watched an awesome documentary called The Bill Hicks Story, and I kind of renewed my interest in him, and I've mentioned him so many times on this podcast, and, you know, he's such a big influence to a lot of other comedians that, you know, I really wanted to make a podcast about it and just talk about it. And again, really interesting story and really interesting guy. You know, he kind of crossed a lot of borders, and he was around for a while, but he didn't really have as much mainstream success in the States. But again, many stand-up comedians today that are out there love him and always cite him kind of as a major influence for their work. So a little bit about Bill Hicks. He was born December 16th, 1961 in Valdosta, Georgia. Soon his family moved to Houston, Texas when he was 7. Bill's older brother and sister were about 6 and 7 years older than him, so significantly older. It was interesting, you know, my sister's about that much younger than me, and there is quite a bit of a gap there. And, you know, especially being an older brother, obviously you're very protective, and when your sibling is much younger, you can't really play with them the way you'd like to play with your friends and do all that stuff just because they're little, and that's okay. So you end up having kind of a little bit more of a protective relationship, or at least not as close. And, you know, when you're that far away, you're not going to be in high school at the same time together, and you're not going to necessarily have those sibling relationships kind of thing that some other kids have, where their brothers or sisters are only a couple years or a year difference in age. Anyway, so I find you see that when there's a big difference between kids, that there is kind of that more individuality in their personality and everything. You know, Bill played football. He did all that fun stuff. I mean, growing up in Texas in the 70s, I'm sure, you know, you had to kind of be part of sports and doing your thing. He probably played all types of sports, but he loved playing football, and football is huge in Texas, so I get it. And he met his best friend Dwight Slade playing football. They were really tight, you know, always doing everything together, and they started their own comedy team together. This is, you know, obviously they're, you know, in their early teens, you know, 10, 11, 12 kind of thing when they're getting together and playing around. But they were really serious. They loved comedy. They loved comedy shows and sketch comedy and all that fun stuff. Bill Hicks' family was pretty straight edge by the sounds of it. And I mean, you know, a lot of families back then, you know, if they were starting a family, going to have a family, they weren't necessarily going against the books. They were kind of, you know, playing the part that, you know, society kind of laid out for them, and, you know, they were religious and followed that. and they actually were Southern Baptist, which is a pretty strict pretty strict Christian faith. Bill Hicks' brother said they used to say the Hicks family was raised fundamentalist Christian, and no, that's wrong. They were raised Southern Baptist, and that's much worse. So it's just like, I don't know if I even mentioned it already in a podcast, but basically Southern Baptist is like a direct interpretation of the Bible, and there's like Westboro Baptist Church is kind of like an offshoot of Southern Baptist, and they are like, God's against gays and doing all that craziness, and like, it's just awful. But it's like, it's a little bit misplaced, obviously, and again, very strict in its rules by the sounds of it. Bill's siblings, as soon as they were old enough, went away to college, so it kind of left Bill at home alone with his parents for quite some time. While Bill and Dwight still were continuously getting serious about writing comedy, at the same time they also started jamming with their other friend Kevin Booth. So they were playing music together, which is super cool. Bill Hicks's life really involves a lot of music. It seems like at certain points in his life he does come back to music, and it's kind of always there from him, which is really interesting, and I can definitely relate to that. While Bill and Dwight were kind of getting their comedy chops together, Houston's Comedy Workshop started hosting an open mic. The problem is, obviously, when you're high school kids, like, Bill and Dwight were like 14, 15. They're trying to go to basically a nightclub on a school night. So their parents definitely weren't going to allow them to do that, especially since they were Southern Baptist. So basically they had to sneak out, devise different ways to get in and out. So their buddy Kevin Booth, he had like a hardship license, which is like a farmer's license, which I guess you can get before you're 16. So he was 14 years old with this license, and they would take this big van, this like Winnebago kind of thing, into town and go and perform their comedy, which must have been wild. Apparently all the fellow comedians were super supportive, and again, it's kind of like funny in the fact that there's like these 14, 15-year-old kids like trying to come up and like do comedy and stuff. It must have been funny. Unfortunately, they got busted, and they I think they really only got one night in at the Comedy Workshop. But again, it just piqued their interest, and they wanted to continue on. Unfortunately, Dwight's family moved to Oregon, so they moved way far away across the country, and Bill really did at this point throw himself into music. So again, like I said, music being there for him, it was there, and he felt that he was a little bit more, I don't know, maybe you can have a little bit more creativity or more support. Who knows exactly what it was, but since Dwight left, Bill had to now try and do comedy as a solo act. Apparently at the time, Dwight was doing some comedy without Bill, but Bill had never been on stage without Dwight at this point. They were kind of like a duo, right? So while Bill was trying to, work on his own comedy, his buddy Kevin introduced him to David Jondro, who was a photographer, and Bill and David became really close friends with Kevin, and they followed Bill around and, became his photographer, and, they would, it kind of started another more creative, friendship that Bill's had, probably missing Dwight around too. But anyway, so while this was going on, when Bill was about 18 years old, he decided to move out to LA to pursue comedy. Again, he was dead serious about it. He really wanted to do this. This was his dream. The rest of his family, including his parents, were college grads, but he clearly went a different way. And it must be really interesting like that. It's funny, in my family, at least even in my immediate family, a couple of my cousins got their university degrees, but we were kind of all the first ones to do that. In my immediate family, I definitely was. And, it's kind of, it's one of those things where I guess it just depends on your personality. It depends on who you are as a person. But sometimes you don't necessarily really want to follow in your parents' footsteps. And I think sometimes that goes either way. I wonder if all my family were university educated, I should say, in Canada. If they all were university educated, would I have pursued what I pursued? I mean, again, I've mentioned before, there was that whole thing about football, got me into university. I don't regret a second of it. I love it. But anyway, it's interesting. I mean, being that, like, I wonder what it would be like to be that kind of black sheep and really go away and really pursue. But his family knew that he had a gift, and they were, of course, very supportive. So after Bill left home and went to LA, he kind of basically lived the rest of his life like that, on the road, doing his thing. I didn't really go into it too much in the Joey Diaz podcast or even in the stand-up comedy podcast, but as a comedian, you spend a lot of time on the road, and that would be really, really interesting. I mean, some guys thrive off it, some guys don't. Obviously, there's drugs and alcohol and women and all that kind of craziness too on the road. But it's like, you think about some of these comedians, and they had to bust their ass to get to where they were. And with Bill starting so early, he was in comedy for so long, basically starting at 15. He had already put in a few years by the time he moved out to LA. So kept banging out there, got a place to live. He became a regular at the Comedy Store, the world famous Comedy Store there. That's still kicking to this day. Dwight Slade actually ended up moving to LA, and him and Bill lived together. Dwight left the University of Oregon to write a movie with Bill. They wrote the movie and they went and pitched it, and people just passed on it. They were like 19 years old. Who knows? There's probably a multitude of reasons why it was passed on, but anyway, it bummed Bill out really bad, and he kind of was dejected from thinking about writing movies. And Dwight was like, "Yo, we'll write another one. Let's try something else." But Bill was really, Bill really wanted to pursue stand-up comedy at this point only, which is interesting. So maybe he kind of got like a bit of a kick in the pants there, and kind of realized what he really loves, which is cool. At 21, he left LA and did come home to Houston. At this point, he and his buddy Kevin did mushrooms for the first time. So one of the big reasons kind of why I really got into Bill Hicks was his comedy, of course, and other comedians always talking about him, but he always used to talk about Terence McKenna. In fact, listening to Bill Hicks is the reason why I ever heard of Terence McKenna. And Bill Hicks talks about all the mushroom research that Terence McKenna has done in some of his comedy, and that's why I've kind of always been drawn to him as a person. He was really connected with psychedelics, and that was a big part of what influenced some of his art. And this is kind of the first foray for him into mushrooms. In fact, Bill at this point hadn't even drank or smoked cigarettes or smoked weed or anything at this point. So he's trying mushrooms before anything else. Loved it. It kind of opened his world, and kind of, gave him a little bit of that fearlessness that allows you to really, tap into some of the thoughts that other people might not necessarily be really aware of, or and that's comedy, right? Bringing ideas to light and showing people things they might not have thought about before. That's what comedy is all about. So being able to bring your experiences from the psychedelic world into this one in a comedic fashion can be very enlightening, very eye-opening for everybody. About a month after he tried doing mushrooms, he drank for the first time. So this is what kind of got him into. So, I mean, I don't want to call it a gateway drug, but again, it's interesting. Once he tried one thing, he kind of wanted to try everything. And that seems to be Bill's personality. But so about a month later, he tried drinking for the first time, and he asked his buddies, what's a drink people drink? And they said margaritas. So he goes up to the bartender and says, "Can I have 7 margaritas?" and down 7 and then goes right up on stage. His act obviously became a lot more unhinged and wild, and people started noticing, and it kind of, again, alcohol lowers your inhibitions, right? So anything that might have been holding Bill back from saying certain things was no longer there. So Bill continued to work at the comedy workshop in Houston. They had like a little the comics annex or something in the back of the store, of the comedy workshop, I should say, in Houston. So anyway, still packed, people waiting outside, coming, and this was something that, Bill Hicks was kind of bringing comedy back to Houston in a way. He'd gone to LA, tried to do his thing, and now he's kind of coming, bringing some of that home. And Jay Leno started coming to the comedy workshop, and Jay Leno is a tremendous stand-up comedian. Obviously hosted the Late Show, Tonight Show. Anyway, was a late night talk show host, and again had comedians on all the time, and he was really important figure, and he actually made some calls for Bill, and Bill got on the Tonight Show. So his career started taking off. Essentially, back in these days too, in the late 80s, early 90s, getting on the Tonight Show was like, I don't know, getting on Joe Rogan today, getting even bigger than getting a Netflix special or something on YouTube. It's just like that kind of meant like you made it, because all these people kind of saw you, right? So as his career was starting to take off, his parents were obviously interested and wanted to support, but Bill didn't want his parents to come because he's kind of a darker comic. I haven't really mentioned this so much, but his comedy, and I obviously encourage everyone to go check out some of his comedy, and I hope by the end of this podcast you're as interested as I am, but go check out his comedy. It's a little dark, it's a little edgy, so it's not for everybody, and swearing and this and that, so I doubt his parents were interested in swearing, but he just didn't want his parents showing up, and I kind of get it. Like, what, you want to go off and you don't want to feel held back at all, or just you don't want to embarrass yourself or whatever it is. I kind of get where he's coming from. So one day his parents actually snuck into one of his shows. Obviously he's a big name, he's got big shows. You can go and sneak in if you want. Trust me, I've had people sneak into shows that you didn't necessarily want there, but not my parents. I always want them there. So they snuck in, they were in shock, but they were proud. They saw him, they didn't really know what to expect or make of his act, but they knew he was up there and he was happy with what he was doing, which is amazing. So, like I've mentioned before, Bill's comedy was pretty dark, and pretty extreme, and he was that all or nothing type guy, and it really did come across in his comedy. Obviously with his drinking and everything too, this was a big part of his act, and kind of sometimes you didn't know what Bill was going to show up. Sometimes he probably got too hammered and just started screaming into the microphone, but there's probably a fine line there where he was probably riding it perfectly, and you probably saw some magic. Speaking of magic, Bill and his friends kept experimenting with mushrooms. They went to Kevin's family's ranch, and they would do 5 grams, because that's what Terrence McKenna says is a heroic dose, 5 dried grams. And at one point, Kevin and Bill had a shared experience of them walking into a tunnel of light and basically walking into a spaceship. And Bill was kind of asking, there was like alien beings there, I guess, and Bill was asking, what are you here for? What's this all about? And they told him the boundaries of space and time are just in our mind. We are all one, and everything is one. And, this reverberated in their minds, and they started coming up from the trip and everything. And Kevin just thought it was in his mind. He was kind of skeptical, but Bill was sure it was real. And he told Kevin exactly what he experienced too. So it's hard with psychedelics that there are shared experience sometimes. I've touched on this topic before in previous podcasts, but there is a shared experience aspect in the fact that, well, our brains are similar. brains aren't completely different necessarily, so they do share some chemistry. So presumably a drug is going to have, relatively the same effect on another person. But there are times where you think, oh man, this is completely in my head. And then all of a sudden your buddy will tell you that's exactly what I saw or felt or heard at the same time too. I did a trip once where I swore that I was speaking, I was communicating with other guys in the trip, telepathically kind of thing. But no one ever really confirmed nor denied that. So I always wonder about that. But again, shared experiences are very, very fascinating with psychedelics. And obviously, Bill and Kevin had one here. And again, these lessons that he got and these things that he would bring back from these major trips, it wasn't just going out there having fun, getting blasted with your buddies. He wanted to really get something out of it. And again, it really influenced that fearlessness. And, Bill's whole thing was he wanted to broadcast cutting edge ideas to the public. And like I said, he'd hit you with a joke and then he'd drop some major knowledge on you, right? So I got one of his jokes here. I'm only going to read 2 jokes right verbatim from Bill today because I definitely don't have his delivery and I don't want to dishonor his name, but some of these are too good to be true. Like I said, go out and check these for real. But with this fearlessness and all these influences coming from psychedelics, you can kind of tell that again, Bill's trying to really bring these ideas to people because especially in the early 90s, late 80s, no one was touching these in mainstream, at least. No one was touching these ideas. So he's talking about LSD, and he always says it's always the same LSD story. You've all seen it. Young man on acid thought he could fly, jumped out of a building. What a tragedy. What a dick. Fuck him. He's an idiot. If he thought he could fly, why didn't he take off from the ground first? Check it out. You don't see ducks lined up to catch elevators to fly south. They fly from the ground, you moron. Quit ruining it for everybody. He's a moron. He's dead. Good. We lost a moron. Fucking celebrate. Wow, I just felt the world get lighter. We lost a moron. I don't mean to sound cold or cruel or vicious, but I am. So that's the way it comes out. Professional help is being sought. How about a positive LSD story? Wouldn't that be newsworthy? Just once? To base your decision on information rather than scare tactics and superstition and lies? I think it would be newsworthy. Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death, life is only a dream, and we're the imagination of ourselves. Here's Tom with the weather. Again, hilarious, but there's that nugget of truth. There's that nugget that really makes you think where, why do... the news is, this is another thing that Bill kind of said too, the news is subjective, right? It's supposed to be, or objective, whatever. It's supposed to be the news. It's supposed to give you, what's happening, but there's never a positive drug story. So again, things like that where, he does kind of make you question things in a way. So at this point, like I mentioned before, Bill had not broken his sprite, but started drinking, and it was kind of started to get out of hand. This is a few years into his career. People described Bill's drinking like it was throwing gas on a fire. So it really just kind of wound him up. Drinking like any other drug, alcohol like any other drug, it's just going to make you more of what you already are. So, if you are amazing and you know how to handle your liquor and, you're a good person or you have talent somewhere, that's not going to go away. In fact, sometimes it might be magnified and highlighted. But the problem is when you become dependent on that alcohol, substance, whatever it might be, to get you into that, and you forget that ability and that talent is always within you, no matter what you do. So like I mentioned before, when he was really drunk, some shows wouldn't work out so well. Again, he'd be on his back screaming. His brother showed up to a show, brought a lot of friends, and it just wasn't funny anymore. some acts didn't mind, but some clubs didn't mind that because he was still Bill Hicks and he was famous and people were coming to the shows, but some people wouldn't book him. Sometimes his act would just slowly devolve into a drunken stupor, which is too bad. Again, there was probably some nights where he was riding that edge right on top of it, and he was amazing. But again, sometimes, you know, people would show up to the shows, and it would be like, let's see how drunk we can get Bill, not let's see, you know, what he has to say. His friends and family kind of somewhat watched on helplessly. You know, it's tough. I mean, I've seen some friends battle with substance abuse, and it is very hard. You do kind of end up just watching helplessly and hoping that, you know, it doesn't get worse, or hoping that your friends have it under control, because, you know, sometimes even mentioning it or highlighting it can make it worse, and you can it's so messy, and it's so scary and delicate, and you don't want to push any boundaries, and you don't want to, you know, push anyone over the edge. But, you know, like I said, when he's doing shows and people are feeding him drinks, obviously he's going to drink them. And because he's jacked up and his adrenaline's flowing because he's on stage, he could drink them. You know, it's kind of like Sam Kinison, who's another great stand-up comedian. And, you know, people would be giving him drugs, giving him coke, giving him all kinds of shit, as soon as Sam Kinison would walk into the bar, someone would put down a huge line, and Kinison just felt like he had to do it because that's who his character was. So it's interesting with these stand-up comedians too, because they do have a persona on stage that sometimes these lines are kind of blurred, whether that's their real personality or not. And sometimes, you know, the crowd just wants a show, and it starts to become a little bit of a gladiator scenario where you're asking people if they're entertained because they don't care if you're up there and you fucking kill yourself, because they just want to see a show. So it's interesting. And, you know, some artists, that's what they want. They want to fucking bleed on stage, but, you know, the audience isn't necessarily at fault there. It's a reaction from the crowd. And I mentioned last time with Joey Diaz, it's very interesting with stand-up comedy because you do have a very intimate relationship with you and the crowd as the performer. Other things like music and stuff, essentially you could be up there performing. It doesn't matter if there's a crowd there. It doesn't matter if there's 10 or 10,000 people there. You're going to be playing the same song. But comedians tend to have a little bit more give and take. Let's just put it that way, with the audience. So again, sometimes the crowd can just ask for too much. So, you know, when Bill was kind of in his late 20s, he really recognized that his drinking was becoming a problem. And of course, you know, a lot of other comedians have substance abuse issues. So Bill and a fellow comedian quit drinking. They did like the 12-step program, AA kind of thing. And one of the hardest things about quitting substance abuse is you got to get away from all your friends that you used to partake in the substances with. So the best thing you can kind of do, which is a little bit, I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but anyway, one of the best things you can do is you can move to a big city by yourself. You can kind of disappear. You don't know anybody. You don't know where you can get drugs anyway. I mean, if you really tried, you can find out, of course, but you know, you tend to be extremely anonymous, and you can kind of just blend into the background, so to speak. So he disappeared from his friends and moved to New York City. He really needed a new environment, and again, it just gave him that break from being around all of his friends and all of the booze and alcohol, or booze and substances. I don't know. There wasn't much else. I don't think he was doing, probably coke and stuff, but it sounded like mostly the booze was the issue. When he got sober, his brother said he went from an above average comedian to something spectacular. Again, Bill really did open your mind with comedy. You know, but it didn't necessarily have to be funny. Again, that whole get you with the joke and then hit you with some info that's going to make you think. It's almost like he opened you up for that gut punch. And again, maybe it wasn't necessarily laughs he was getting, but it was making people think. And it's a fine line, because you don't really want to lose an audience, but at the same time you want to stay loyal to your art. So I think Bill did have troubles with that sometimes, where he probably lost a lot of audiences and had a lot of people leaving there thinking he wasn't all that funny, but because they just wanted to go and hear dick jokes and shit like that. So meanwhile, he's dropping major philosophical knowledge on you, right? And again, comedy is one way to do it. You can do it in a dramatic fashion and do big talks and do this and that, but there's not too many other people that you pay to talk, maybe a professor or something like that. But other than stand-up comedians, there's not other people that we just pay to talk like this. And maybe they are the modern version of the philosopher, but Bill was definitely more of a philosopher. So, like I said, it's easy to lose an audience doing this, right? So, and because his comedy was also fairly extreme and it was a little bit pushy, it was pushing too many boundaries for American audiences. They really didn't dig it. So he started going to the UK, where audiences weren't nearly as quick to take offense. I think British audiences have a different understanding of comedy, and I think it's always tough too, with making, a lot of Bill's comedy really made fun of the United States and his hometown and his homeland and all that stuff. And I think, Americans can be really touchy about all that stuff for sure. So when Bill turned about 30, him and his friends got together and started a band. Actually, it was on the first night of the first Gulf War, which was in 1991. He started a band called Marblehead Johnson, which is a really cool act. They actually are kind of like a comedy music act. So Bill is actually a tremendous guitar player. He's been, obviously, like I mentioned, going back and forth with music his whole life, but he's a really good guitar player. And he kind of intersperses little bits and little comedy, spoken word things in throughout his music. And some of his songs are really funny. I've mentioned before, and, Frank Zappa says that music has a humor to it. There is a comedy that can be in music, and it can be very funny. And when you do blatantly mix comedy and music, it's just seems like a match made in heaven. So like I said, Bill always had that music going. So when he started Marblehead Johnson, it was just, again, one more outlet that he could continue doing his music, and stay close with his friends, I think, too, which is so cool. I love it. So as I mentioned, Bill had a lot of success in the UK, and Bill also, in around 91, found a new audience at the Just for Laughs Comedy Festival in Montreal. And if you haven't seen it, go check out the Joey Diaz podcast. I talk about it a little bit, but, Just for Laughs Comedy Festival is basically like the Cannes Film Festival, but for comedy. And again, Canadian and British audiences, I think, are in that same boat where maybe they're a little bit more intelligent. No offense to all of our American listeners, but I don't think it necessarily has anything to do with that. I think it's the fact that, again, Bill does talk a lot of shit about the U.S. and, again, people are patriotic and they don't really feel it, where other countries, it's more of an outside looking in perspective. And I think it allows people to kind of sit back and laugh at things a little bit more. It was also, coming off the Reagan era, America thought they were all number one. So no one wanted anyone like Bill Hicks pointing out the fact that they're not number one and there's a lot of mistakes being made here and there. Anyway, what can you do? So, like I said, Bill continued to pursue those British audiences. He started touring the UK in 1992, and he filmed one of his specials, Revelations, which is a tremendous, tremendous special. Go check that out, please. If you've never watched any of Bill Hicks and you're listening to this podcast, go check out Revelations. Absolutely amazing. There's another one. There's another one that he Bill filmed in Montreal too. But check out Revelations. It is so good. His bits are so tight, and it is that perfect kind of mix of his anger, but along with his it's almost like he hits you with this angry joke and then softens the blow with this, mind-provoking, thought-provoking kind of, image that he brings to the table. God bless. Anyway, by the end of June 1993, he was starting to complain about stomach problems. He called his brother to ask about making a doctor's appointment, and at that point, he was diagnosed with cancer. He kind of kept that close to the chest. He didn't tell everyone, but he wanted to move back to Houston for his chemo treatments. So Bill and his brother drove from LA to Houston. Bill drove the entire way. He didn't let his brother drive, and you kind of wonder, did he think, maybe this was his last drive and he's got to kind of take advantage of it? And but I think it was, well, obviously it's a long ass drive. It's got to be a few days. So again, you start to see certain things over these next couple months for Bill, where it looks like he's trying to tie up some loose ends, so to speak. Kept doing his comedy. He was recording an album with Marblehead Johnson called, or a few albums actually, called Marblehead Johnson and Arizona Bay. He was recording a few albums with Marblehead Johnson. One of them was called Arizona Bay. Another one's called Rant in E Minor. Again, very interesting albums where they kind of mesh live comedy recordings, little bits that Bill recorded in the studio, songs with lyrics, and then all the other music that they do, and it's kind of like blues rock, kind of Texas rock. It's very, very cool music. During these last few months, Bill and his friends did one last trip at the ranch. He didn't really tell anyone at this point that this was probably going to be his last time, and it would have been really interesting to do a mushroom trip with that much heaviness around. I guess that's probably why he didn't tell his friends. I mean, one time I did a trip with my buddies, and one of my friends, his father was really sick, and at that point I hadn't really sat down with him and talked. We weren't necessarily, we were extremely close, best of friends, but how guys are sometimes, they don't really talk about really deep stuff all the time. And I felt so bad, and I wanted to address it. And when we were on the mushrooms, we kind of talked about it, and it wasn't a breakthrough or anything, but at the same time, when that heaviness does the heaviness will sometimes kind of make itself to the surface if it's there. But again, having that time with your buddies and spending that time and expanding their minds a little bit more, and I will say this, not that I was ever really afraid of death, but psychedelics have always really eased my concerns about, something existing either past this, or even if there isn't, there's other types of experiences in life. And, maybe it does help you, especially in those, in days where you're facing mortality, to kind of, understand things a little bit better. Bill did his final performance at Igby's in LA in February, Bill's last performance was at Igby's in LA in 1994. No one kind of knew it was his last. No one really knew he was dying. He said this was going to be his last performance, but no one really kind of knew. People kind of thought maybe he's going to move away to the UK and continue to pursue his career over there, but no one really knew. Bill passed away on February 26, 1994 in Little Rock, Arkansas at the age of 32, and he had pancreatic cancer. So really tough. My grandfather passed away from that too. But again, it's Bill Hicks's comedy was very interesting. Again, it's not, you don't have to you don't have to laugh, or things don't have to be necessarily funny for you to be a comedian and for you to really open people's eyes. He was really able to deliver that true experience of the court jester, tell you the truth right to your face, even though you might not want to hear it, but do it with a smile and a joke to kind of soften the blow. Open you up with a joke, but still make you think. And, I'll leave you with this last joke, if you want to call it a joke, but it's a really important message, I think, that Bill uses to close some of his specials. But it's a tremendous closer, A, but B, really think about these words I'm about to read. It's a very, in my opinion, it's a very interesting representation of how psychedelics make you feel and what they can do and how they can reveal what life kind of is. And it's a really nice reminder, because I always say, when I do psychedelics, I'm always reminded of a feeling. It's not something I forget. It's not something that I'm learning for the first time. It's always this feeling of remembering. So here's a little piece by Bill Hicks. The world is like a ride in an amusement park. And when you choose to go on it, you think it's real because of how powerful our minds are. The ride goes up and down, around and around. It has thrills and chills. It's very brightly colored, and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Many people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to wonder, hey, is this real or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us and say, hey, don't worry. Don't be afraid ever, because this is just a ride. And we kill those people. Shut him up. I've got a lot invested in this ride. Shut him up. Look at my frowns of worry. Look at my big bank account and my family. This has to be real. It's just a ride. But we always kill the good guys who try and tell us that. Have you ever noticed that? But we always kill the good guys who try to tell us that. And we let the demons run amok. But it doesn't matter, because it's just a ride. And we can change it at any time we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. Just a simple choice. Right now, between fear and love. The eyes of fear want you to put bigger locks on your doors, buy guns, close yourself off. The eyes of love instead see all of us as one. Here's what we can do to change the world right now to a better ride. Take all the money we spend on weapons and defenses each year and instead spend it on feeding and clothing and educating the poor of the world, which it would pay for many times over. Not one human being excluded, and we can explore space together, both inner and outer, forever in peace. Thank you so much, everyone. Love you, Bill Hicks. Rest in peace. Check him out. Check out his specials. If you guys like the podcast, please rate it. Share it with your friends. Check us out on Instagram. Check us out on Twitter at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. Support the podcast at the Patreon, patreon.com/the Bigmark Podcast. Hit the bell, subscribe, like, do all that stuff. Like Bill Hicks says, play from your heart. Go out there and keep at it. I love you all. We'll see you next week. Peace.